quickly, I'm going to start off by just reiterating some of the stuff that Morna has covered about the core values that are within our code. I understand that some of the people on this call might have more or less experience of what the code is and how it works. So just to quickly run through that all the rules in the 2019 code, the current code, and in the new code are based on the principles and the values that fundraising should be legal, so meet the requirements of the law. It should be open, so fundraisers should be willing to share information about where the donations are going and how they're going to be used. It should be honest, so obviously shouldn't mislead people or take advantage of mistakes that they make, and that it should be respectful. And so it should be respectful of people who are asking for donations, but also the environments that you're working in and the wider environment as well. So all those values apply to the rules in the current code, but they've also been the basis of the rules for the 2025 code that I'm going to talk to you about now. Some quick information about the code review itself. It is a long and exhaustive. Has been a long and exhaustive process. There's been several points of consultation with the sector. Call for information back in the autumn of 2022, where we spoke mostly to larger organizations who would have a kind of overview of the code itself, and they were in favor of us moving towards a principles-based approach, changing how we present information about legal requirements and just more broadly sort of streamlining the code. We used the insights from the call for information to put together the first consultation in 2023, where we set out proposals for every single one of the 430 odd rules that are in the 2019 code about whether we should remove it, revise it, or retain it. And then we took on board the feedback to redraft the code and have a subsequent consultation in autumn of 2024 on the actual redrafted code, so giving people an opportunity to endorse the approach or let us know what was going on, what they thought could be potential pitfalls of the new rules that we were following. We finally got to the process of launching the code in late April, and we're now in a 6-month implementation period with the new code coming into place on the 1st of November. And I'll finish up the presentation by talking about how you can be prepared for that 1st of November deadline. Some quick information on the process of redrafting. So we reviewed every single consultation response we received. The two public consultations, so the two sector consultations had about 250,000 words of responses, and human beings read every word of those and considered what the people's challenges were and what the evidence was for the basis of their decisions. Then we also engaged with wider stakeholders. So that includes the panel who were involved in a lot of decision making at our committees, but also the Chartered Institute of Fundraising, Charity Retail Association, charity lawyers, people like that, and also regulators whose work overlaps with the work of the Fundraising Regulator, so advertising standards, Information Commissioner's Office, Gambling Commission, people like that, to make sure that what we were setting out, the expectations that we had, didn't conflict with other regulatory obligations that charities might have. All the decisions that we made, as I said, were approved by our board and committees, where there are fundraising practitioners who are members of our committees. We have representation from the panel, we have representation from the Chartered Institute of Fundraising, and we also have committee members and board members who are current fundraisers, people who've got extensive experience in fundraising, so they could make sure that the rules that we were setting out were realistic and attainable. And the final stage was a legal review to make sure none of our rules conflicted with legal obligations, and a crystal mark accreditation by the Plain English Campaign to make sure that the new code is as clear and accessible in its use of language as the 2019 code is, which was also crystal mark accredited. Some of the key changes that I'm going to talk about are removed how we present legal information in the code. There's a lot of rules in the 2019 code that use the word must in bold to indicate that it represents a legal requirement. However, because these are legal requirements, they're covered by statutory bodies and not covered by the fundraising regulator. And so there's a risk of confusion that we had a whole section of rules explaining data protection requirements that we're actually trying to reframe the law into a different format. And it isn't really the role of the fundraising regulator to intervene on data protection issues. That's the role of the Information Commissioner's Office, who's the lead regulator. So instead, we present that information differently. I'll be showing you some examples of that in the new code, but that's had a big impact on making the code significantly shorter. We haven't just taken things out, we've added some new rules, which I'll be showing you examples of later on, but on engaging with the fundraising regulator, protections for fundraisers, and also unstaffed collections, which is sort of uh, places where people can make donations where there often isn't a fundraiser present, and so they can't ask for more information. They can't get some follow-up, so they need to be provided with certain information right up front every time to make sure they can make an informed donation decision. Um, but all these factors have meant that there's a significantly shorter code, which will hopefully make it more accessible to people who are already familiar with the code and also to people who are coming to the code fresh, people who are new to fundraising or people who um, are new to the concept of fundraising regulation, weren't even aware that they were subject to our rules, making it easier for them to understand those. When we launched the code, we provided a selection of supporting documents. One quite useful one for people who are already familiar with the 2019 code is the table of changes, which maps out how the old rules correspond to the new rules. So if you're used to, when you're running a fundraising event, you know that you need to check rule 11.2.1 in the event section. It will tell you, well, how is that rule now covered? Has it been retained exactly? Has it been removed? Is it covered under a new principle? That's all explained in the table of changes. There's also the consultation summary document, which explains how we made the decisions that we made. So it's showing how we considered the insights from the consultation respondents and, excuse me, and how we reached the final wording that we now have for the rules within the 2025 code. And then finally, we have these three code support guides, which are illustrated in the slide. You've got due diligence for fundraising, monitoring fundraising partners, and documenting fundraising decisions. These play a key role in helping you understand how to demonstrate your compliance with the new principles-based rules. Those three topics are quite significant for areas of risk and working in partnerships. And so we wanted to make sure that we had those areas covered alongside the new code so people could understand how we actually expect them to comply with what the new principles are. It's worth pointing out, though, that these are guidelines, they're not checklists. They're showing you ways that you could potentially effectively monitor a fundraising partnership or the ways that it could be appropriate to perform due diligence in your fundraising. But it's not saying in all circumstances you must do this. There's a clear understanding that there's room for variations in approaches based on the size and scale and nature of the fundraising campaign, and that a large national charity running an event across all the regions will probably have a higher level of monitoring and due diligence than a small local charity running a bake sale. There's a understanding that there isn't a one size fits all model for these approaches. So just before I get onto the examples, what is a principles-based rule? What's the point of a principles-based rule? One big advantage is that the principles can apply across a whole range of different scenarios. And as a result, that makes for a more streamlined code where you don't need to have a specific rule for every context in which it applies. And if there's a general principle about how you should behave, that principle will apply whether you're doing face-to-face fundraising, whether you're sending emails, whether you're talking to someone on the phone. That's the advantage of that. And it also means that fundraisers don't need to wait for us to create a whole new set of rules whenever a new fundraising approach comes out, whenever a new tool emerges, or whenever people are starting to use new functionality. They don't need to wait until we've written new rules on it. They will be able to take the principles and apply them to that context. And although there has been a lot of change in making the code significantly shorter, there is a lot of continuity in there. Virtually every protection that is afforded to donors in the 2019 code is retained in the 2025 code. I'll shortly be showing you one of the very few examples where we've changed one of those, but for the most part, those protections have been retained and several of them have actually been extended. So because the principles apply more broadly than rigid prescriptive rules saying in this scenario you must do this and in that scenario you must do that, um, actually some of the protections have been extended. Um, and we're not leaving you completely on your own to figure out what the principles look like. Quite a lot of the rules are accompanied by examples of how you can meet that principle. These are always presented as non-exhaustive, always with the understanding that there may be other ways that you can meet a principle, but uh, it's a useful way to lay out what the things that you must always do or things that you must never do, the key requirements and prohibited practices, what they are, so that fundraisers can understand that, and also importantly, so donors can understand that, so donors can know, oh, fundraisers are never allowed to do this, and that happened to me, so I've got a problem with it. So yeah, the easiest thing to do is to show you some examples. I've got a few of these to run through. First one, just to be clear, I'm not going to talk in detail about what's on the left-hand side. I'll be zooming in a second on the main rules. So you don't need to be able to read the detail of that. But essentially what you have in the 2019 code is four rules that cover the broad issue of persuasion and intrusion, and they're split across different parts of the code. And we've combined those four rules into a single principle that retains and actually extends the protections that are afforded there. Um, this the reason I'm staying on this one a little longer is that this is one example where we've actually taken out a requirement in the code. The 2019 code has a requirement 1.1.2 that you must be polite to people at all times. And we considered that that is actually overly restrictive on fundraisers and unreasonable. It means that they can't um, respond appropriately to inappropriate behavior sometimes. And so whenever we look at the new rule, that requirement isn't actually covered in the new rule because we considered that it doesn't reflect a reasonable expectation on fundraisers. So instead, the new rule says that you must take all reasonable steps to ensure your fundraising is conducted in a way that reflects positively on fundraising in general. So that's a good broad principle that people will have a general understanding of. And then there's some specific examples of what that might look like. So not unreasonably intruding on privacy, not placing undue pressure on a person to donate, or being unreasonably persistent, and also accepting a request to end an interaction. And this is a good example of where um, the principle can apply across a whole range of contexts. If you're talking to someone in the street, if you're talking to someone on the doorstep, if you're talking to someone on the phone, and they indicate that they want to end the interaction, you should end the interaction because that is a way of conducting your fundraising that reflects positively on fundraising in general. We don't need to have a separate rule for telephones that says this. We don't need to have a separate rule for door to door, a separate rule for cash collections, and a separate rule for direct debits. We have a general principle that applies across all those contexts and will apply to any context we haven't even imagined yet. Um, so the next example, again, we don't need to see the detail on the left-hand side here, but what you have in the 2019 code is three rules that go into quite a bit of detail about uh, how fundraisers should be paid, and they use some uh, specific language that isn't necessarily reflective of the current approaches. You know, commission is not a terminology that's used that frequently. Excessive payments is there's a degree of ambiguity in what excessive means in that regard. So what we have done instead is that we've created a single principles-based rule that in just 23 words has covered the territory that the previous rules covered in over 100, that says that you must give appropriate consideration to the approach that you choose for paying fundraisers and whether this fits the values of your charitable institution. So this doesn't outlaw or it doesn't sort of place a restriction on any specific types of payment, but it does say that you have to consider it appropriately and how that fits the values of your organization. These requirements are informed in part also by the market inquiry that we conducted into subcontracting, uh, which took place during one of our consultations that kind of overlapped with it. But it found that organizations are using commission-based payments in a way that is fair and effective, but it does present a risk. And so it's more that you have to give proper consideration to the risks involved in certain models for paying fundraisers, and also that it may look unusual if you're um, a charity that's, uh, raising money to help people who are experiencing poverty, and you're having difficulty demonstrating that your payment approach can actually lead to a fair wage for the people who are doing that work. So it will have an impact on how uh, some of your partnerships might work if you work with agencies, if you work with third party fundraisers. Uh, but it's saying there isn't a single approach that is prohibited, or we're not saying everybody must get um, this standard, whether, living wage standard set by whatever body. But we are saying that there needs to be appropriate consideration, and that you have to be able to show that that fits the values of the organization. The last full example I'm going to show you here of a changed rule is on training for volunteers. There's a lot of detail here. I'll not go into the detail, uh, but essentially we have 5 rules that overlap between where you're working with and on behalf of volunteers. So that's a volunteer who you've sort of instructed to do fundraising, or who you've got fundraising at an event that you're running. Um, and an in aid of volunteer, which is somebody who is running a marathon and has picked your charity. And the first thing your charity might know about it is when the money lands in your bank account, so you don't have so much control over their activity. But we've taken this sort of selection of rules spread across the volunteer section, and we replaced it with a single rule, um, with a principle up top right at the start of the volunteers section, that says you must provide in aid of and on behalf of volunteers with training and support that's appropriate to the relationship they have with you. So with on behalf of volunteers, those are the ones where you have had more control over their fundraising activity. You possibly directly instructed them to fundraise. Then the rule after the rule, we lay out what that training looks like. So fundraising legally and safely, handling and processing donations. That's very important if somebody's working at an event for you, um, if volunteering at an event for you. Uh, Things to include in fundraising materials. If somebody's a volunteer partner, that they might be producing their own materials, they might need to know those things, and just sort of general behavior and where they can find support and guidance. So the requirements for and on behalf of volunteer, where the charitable institution has more involvement in their activity, are greater than they are for the in aid of volunteer, which are laid out below. And we specify that if you become aware of an in aid of volunteers fundraising activity beforehand, so um, you can't provide somebody with training after the money has landed in your bank account, but if you become aware of it beforehand, you should try and make sure that they use the term in aid of, so people can understand that it's different from fundraising activity that you've actually conducted yourself. Um, Also, that they know that they're responsible for all of it, that if they're running an event, and to raise money for your charity's liability insurance doesn't cover their event. They need to know that, it's their responsibility. You're not taking on any liability by them telling you that they plan to give you that money. And just some general information on where they can find advice. That could just be a link to our guidance on the topic, or you might have your own specific guidance or specific approaches that uh, types of fundraising events that you want to make sure people are aware of how to do those legally and safely. Um, that's just some additional things that you can offer to people who are doing in aid of volunteer fundraising activity. So got one more example of old versus new. This is, I feel like I'll say it again, you don't need to read the detail here, there is a lot of it. This is a scenario where we have uh, a lot of information contained in our rules using the bold must approach that are explaining what the requirements of gift aid are. There's nearly 300 words of content here spread across three different parts of the code, and they all relate to areas where we are not. The Fundraising Regulator and the Scottish panel are not the bodies who would actually do the enforcement on this. If somebody has a concern about inappropriate use of the gift aid small donation schemes, then we're not in a position to investigate that. That needs to be investigated by HMRC. And so instead of having these rules providing what is useful information but can cause confusion and is takes some time to update because we have to go through a full consultation process. Instead, in the new code, we provide these box outs on topics that are specifically relevant to fundraising, and they give you a kind of quick overview of where you can find more information and what the key points are. So instead, we just outline here that what gift aid is. It allows you to reclaim tax on donations from UK taxpayers, who is the lead statutory body, HMRC in this context, and where you can find out more information. So now there is a single place in the code where we explain what gift aid is and where you can find out more and who's responsible for it. We've taken a similar approach with things like offering benefits with a donation, on ID badges, for fundraising, things like that, where we it's not the code's place to outline all the information for you, but we understand that fundraisers do need to know this information and do need to know where to find it. And so we provide signposting to that information rather than trying to explain it in the context of our rules, which is a bit more difficult to do and also means that we can't update that information as flexibly because we're committed to consult on all our rules. Whereas we could, if HMRC produces a new piece of guidance on gift aid, we can just add it to this box. We don't need to wait for another consultation. We don't need to have all that stuff. We can make sure this information is updated flexibly. We also have some other information that was contained in code rules that we've moved to our website and linked to from the code. So information explaining the legal responsibilities of trustees, information about data protection requirements, and information about running charity lotteries. We now host that information on our website and link to it from the code rather than trying to explain it within code rules or in box outs around code rules. We're trying to frame that information a bit more in a way that we can update it more flexibly and just make it more accessible in general. So some of the new rules that we've introduced, one of the big ones is 2.1.2, which is that you must take reasonable steps to protect fundraisers from harm and harassment while fundraising. So this appears in section 2, which is the responsibilities of governing bodies of charitable institutions. So the U here is the governing body, the trustees, whoever they may be. And it explains that this includes having processes for fundraisers to report issues and taking reasonable steps to address the issues that are raised. This was a specific proposal that came about from our call for information and it was discussed in the consultations as well. There was broad support for the idea of extending protections to fundraisers because fundraisers may experience harassment if they're harm or harassment if they're out interacting with the public, because anybody out interacting with the public could experience that. And the rule is written with an understanding that you can't necessarily prevent harassment from happening, but that you should be able to have processes in place to address it if it does happen and prepare people for how to deal with it. So yeah, that's one of the big new rules that didn't really exist in any form in the 2019 code. Another one that didn't really exist in the 2019 code but is very important from a self-regulatory standpoint is 2.1.3, which requires that you should respond constructively and in an appropriate time to inquiries that you receive from Fundraising Regulator or from the panel about keeping to the code. And you have to make sure that your partners do the same, your fundraising partners. This is supported by another document on our website that explains what we expect in terms of engagement with the fundraising regulator. So you know how long we'll give you to respond to something or what level of detail we want and those things. So we're setting our fair expectations of what constructive engagement is, and it'll give us the opportunity in the rare occasions that we're investigating somebody's fundraising and they're not playing ball, they're not cooperating, they're not providing us with responses, or they're just completely ignoring us. We can establish that they've breached the code by ignoring us, and we can then move on to whatever the next stages would be rather than delaying our investigation process further. And this is, as I say, quite common for self-regulatory bodies, especially. Um, and it's a useful addition to the code, but it's actually one that will uh, is unlikely to affect many of you because we do a very small number of investigations, and so most of you will never even have to be aware that this rule exists, but it is there and it's useful for us. Um, so the last couple of examples that I have here, these apply to convenience giving and unstaffed collections. They have their own subsection, section 7.5 of the new code. So what we mean there is, as I mentioned before, sort of fundraising tools where a fundraiser often isn't present. So, tap to donate machines, um, text message donations, QR codes, roundups at tills at supermarkets, charity bags, charity collection points. What these two rules set out is the baseline level of information that we expect charities to provide to donors so that they can make an informed decision about who they're making their donation to and how it's going to be used. So 7.5.1 is this is the information that has to be provided in all contexts. And this is a requirement that already exists in lots of other types of fundraising, or that you have to disclose whenever you're talking to someone on the phone or door to door. But it requires that you must make sure that before making a donation, donors can see clear, accurate, and up-to-date information about the collection, primarily the charitable institution that's receiving the donation and that institution's registration details and contact details. So yeah, are they a charity? Are they a CIC? Are they a social enterprise? That the registration details will tell them that, and the contact details. Then in contexts where there's a third party collector involved, which is very common for charity collection bags and increasingly common with charity donation points, you should also outline how that partner is going to get paid and the contact details for them as well, if it's a different organization. So yeah, these are the baseline levels of information that should be provided in all contexts. And then 7.5.2 is that you should also make sure donors can easily find details of processing fees involved in the donation and any secondary purpose for the donation. For those of you who don't know what secondary purpose is, it's if you're raising funds for a specific purpose. Classic example is building repairing the church roof, and repairing the church roof is going to cost £50,000. What happens if you only raise £40,000? What happens if you raise £80,000? How will that be addressed? And by explaining a secondary purpose, that can help prevent a lot of difficulty in the event that you don't meet the target or exceed the target. But this isn't something that has to be actually there at the collection point every time. So if the space is limited and it's not practical to include that information at the collection point, then you can provide a short link to a web page containing those details. It should be directly to a website containing those details, not just to your homepage or not just to charityname.org/fundraising. It should be to a page that will tell them specifically about that type of donation. So whether it's a specific campaign or whether it's all your charity bag collections or anything like that, it's just there to make sure that there's a level playing field across all the different fundraising methods and that donors can make an informed decision, particularly whenever they're using novel fundraising approaches or new technologies that they might be less familiar with. So now you've seen some of the rules. Just talk you through quickly what is coming next from us. Obviously, we launched the code and we're now in an implementation and engagement period. During that time, we're going to have very limited new investigations. We're only going to investigate in priority areas because we understand that a lot of charities will be working on putting bringing their systems up to the new standards, and it might not be very beneficial to anybody if we investigate something that is already being addressed uh, in aligning with the new code. Also, during the engagement period, we're going to be putting out some additional resources. We already have things ready on uh, working on donors in vulnerable circumstances, cashless donations, online gaming, social media, and events, and they'll be coming out in the coming months. Um, we're going to use the feedback that we get from these engagement events, like the webinars and the other activity that we're doing, to plan what else we put out. So that's why whenever we're going to ask for your feedback at the end of this webinar, that is going to be a useful resource for us to see this is what people are interested in, or this is what people need to be made clearer to them, or this is an area that people would really appreciate some more support in. So that's why these starting off point webinars explaining what we're looking for and asking you what you need will help inform what we do in the coming months. And then once the new code is implemented on the 1st of November, uh, it will be the basis for all our decisions. So any fundraising activity that happens after the 1st of November will be subject to the new code and considered under the new rules. So what can you do as a fundraiser? One of the most important things, obviously, and hopefully quite a few of you will have had a chance in the 5 weeks or so since it's come out, is to read the new code and the supporting documents. You may want to identify the new rules that I've highlighted today and how they might impact you. There are a few others. I didn't go through every single one. Using the table of changes will be very useful for that purpose as well, for letting you see how the old rules and the systems that you have to meet those old rules will map onto the new rules. The A useful thing to then do is to make sure that other stakeholders and people within internal and external know that this is coming. So if you have partnerships with people who are providing resources for fundraising, that they know that they might need to meet different standards now, or that you're planning to update things and it will have an impact on the agreements that you have with them and what your requirements are. Obviously, for those of you who work for larger organizations, you'll want to make sure the rest of your fundraising teams know what's happening and the specific teams know about the specific changes. The events teams know what's changed and the telephone fundraising team know what's changed. And also to pass on this information to the trustees, the governing body of your organization, so they can be ready for this and understand the importance of it. And then during the implementation period, you should be looking to update your processes, whether that's agreements with partners, scripts for fundraisers, training materials, uh, information that you provide alongside some of your collection points, and any sort of wider policies that you have. You should be taking this 6 month implementation period to make sure all those things are ready for the 1st of November. And one of the most effective ways that you can keep track of that is by signing up for the Fundraising Regulator's newsletter, which is where we'll be providing information about when the new resources are published or any additional insights that we have, blogs, FAQs, things like that that come up on our website that are linked to the code reviews.